This is 7 Biblical Readings for a Post-October 7th World, a podcast mini-series brought to you by the Matan Women's Institute for Torah Studies. This entire series is dedicated in memory of the heroes our nation has lost in the past year and a half, and in prayer for the return of our remaining hostages. Today's conversation is with the always insightful Sharansky Danziger. Our conversation is dedicated in memory of Eliav Abitbol, about whom Rachel will share a few words. But first, to introduce, Sharansky Danziger is a Jerusalem-based writer and educator who lectures internationally about the intersections between Jewish text, life in Israel, and the art of storytelling. In addition to teaching Torah at Matan, Pardes, and other online venues, Rachel is the co-editor of the recently published anthologies of prayers, As Nashir, We Will Sing Again, Women's Prayers for Our Time of Need, and As Nashir, Between Silence and Song, Women's Prayers for Our Days of Remembrance and Celebration, and is currently working on a book about family stories in the Book of Judges as a Sefaria fellow. Rachel, it's an honor to have you on this podcast series.
Always good to be with you, Sefa.
And we've had such a pleasure of doing a whole bunch of episodes together. So before we go straight into our episode for today, tell us a little bit about Eliav, about whom we are dedicating today's episode.
So Eliav was a childhood friend of my sister's. They were madrichim together in their youth movement. His parents lived literally across the alley from my parents, so we saw them a lot. And he was a man, I wish I could quote him, but he was not a man of words, he was a man of deeds. He was a man who donated a kidney without telling his friends, because that was the kind of person he was. He was a man who, together with his wife Tal, took care of foster children. Eventually had 4 children of their own, but they had, when he fell in battle, we said that he left 4 children behind it, but way more orphans, because there were all these kids they took care of. And he did it all quietly, without bragging, without drawing attention to it, just because it was what he wanted to do. And I thought it was especially appropriate to dedicate this episode where we will discuss Bamidbar and rising out of crisis to Eliav, because when Eliav was a teenager, he was in a terrible, terrible car accident with fatal consequences for someone else.
Wow.
And it could have been the end of his life story. It could have been the beginning of depression. It could have been the beginning of just, letting go of life. And instead, he dedicated himself to living the best life he could live, to building a family, to doing good everywhere he could. And before we recorded, I asked you if I can mention another fallen soldier. I wanted to mention Rachel Hiller, who was a young woman born in Lodz in Poland in 1924 or 23. And she was, 18 in the Holocaust, and her whole family died in the ghetto. But she kept one brother alive. She kept one brother alive against all odds, even though he was little. And then at the very end of the war, he was killed. And at first she was extremely depressed and lost, and just people who knew her at the time said that she just kind of drifted. She didn't know what to do with herself. She didn't have a cause. She was disappointed. She worked so hard for years to keep her brother alive, and she failed. And then she found her why. She found her why and what for, and that was Zionism. That was coming to Israel and building Israel. And she came here as a ma'apila through illegal immigration. She was sent to a prison camp in Cyprus. She ended up being one of the fighters of Kfar Etzion. Wow. And she fell in battle in Kfar Etzion the day before the foundation of the State of Israel. And she's one of the fallen soldiers who are called Netzer Acharon, the last remnant. And I wanted to remember her today because she doesn't have a family to remember her. And because just like Eliav, in a very different way, she shows us that there's life after tragedy, that losing everything doesn't mean the end. And I feel like we need that reminder now when Rachel is no longer here, and when Eliav is no longer here, and so many others are no longer here. We need this reminder that there's life after loss, that crisis is not the end.
I was thinking last week, we're recording this 2 days before Yom HaZikaron. I was thinking last week when I stood up, I was in the middle of learning with my chavruta, and we stood up for the siren for Yom HaShoah in our home. And I was thinking that this year we need to make the we need to make the sirens longer, right? Sometimes you feel everyone, I'm sure, their heart and their head goes in different directions when they hear sirens, and some people, maybe they'll say Perek of Tehillim, or they just try and think of one person in particular, or they're thinking of nothing, and that's also just to be in the moment and be in that sound. And that sound is something that both bears remembrance and it also creates stress. It's the same sound that means two different things for us, and we kind of, like many of us, I'm sure, have mentally prepared our children before it comes. I know my kids repeat to themselves, there's going to be a siren, but it doesn't mean that we have to go into the safe room. Remind themselves. And but I just kept thinking that, to me, the siren is this thing that carries with it like a layer of humanity. It carries with it a layer of humanity that's been lost. And if we delve into every single person, it's endless. It's utterly endless, and you can't really emerge from it. And part of our survival mechanism is that we don't, and we limit it, and we give it boundaries and borders. But there's so much that's still so fresh, and I'm sure that was true in the early 70s, and that was true in the 40s, and that's always been true. But I just really thought to myself, I just feel like it needs to be longer. It's not enough time to encap. Of course, there won't be enough time even if it was 2.5 minutes, right? But but just that sentiment that the noise carries with it something, and then we let it go. We kind of drop it because we have to. We have to as a society in order to function. But I really appreciate you bringing up those lives, which I'm sure many people are listening. They didn't know them personally. And with that, I guess we'll transition into our conversation for today, which is to kind of reread the book of Bamidbar. We're gonna magically do that in a relatively short span of time. And as our listeners know, this series, we're hearing from just unbelievable teachers and Torah scholars about a text or a series of texts that has resonated differently in the past year and a half, or that they're reading differently than they used to. And you said to me, well, let's do the book of Bamidbar. So why don't you bring us into that, and bring us into what has shifted for you, and why one of the books of the Torah? Meaning, I know that this has been cataclysmic, but to also then say I'm going to reread a book of the Torah is quite an inner earthquake, quite an inner earthquake. So bring us into that, Rachel.
So the truth is that there's two reasons that draw me since the beginning of the war to Bamidbar particularly. And the first has to do with the fact that Bamidbar is the story of a journey that lengthened, of a road that lengthened under our feet, that we expected it to lead from one point to another at a certain span of time, and we had a certain mental image of what's the story gonna be. And then that story was taken from us through our own actions, through our own hesitations. But regardless of the reasons, the story disappeared. The structure we had that gave us a sense of security and purpose disappeared. The road, as far as that generation was concerned, became endless because they were going to die in the desert. That's it. For their personal journey, there is no other end other than death in the desert. And they had to somehow make peace with it and find the strength to get up every morning. And that image of a generation struggling to come to terms and to keep on going as everything is shifting around them has been, I think, for obvious reasons, very poignant and relevant for me. From that first siren on October 7th, from that moment when my neighbor was shrieking in the stairwell about, soldiers not being able to reach the kibbutzim to save hostages. And I didn't believe her. I thought she's exaggerating. I thought she's repeating rumors, but it definitely made me feel as if the earth is gone from underneath my feet. Mm-hmm. And then when we were in shul, and we were in the safe room in the shul, all hundreds of us, and reading about the creation of the world while feeling like our world is coming apart, I kept asking, what do I hold on to? What do I hold on to? Everything is falling apart. I don't understand who we are. And as the magnitude of the tragedy started, being revealed in stages and drips and drops in the coming hours and days, the worse reality was, or the more revealed the magnitude of devastation was, the deeper this feeling of there's nothing to hold on to was or became. And I would say more than that, my sense of where we are in history shifted. It wasn't just my sense of what the IDF is capable of, what we're capable of, what our enemies are capable of, unfortunately. But it's also the sense of, I thought we're already so close to the end of our journey as a people, meaning to the happy ending.
Yeah.
I thought we fought all the big battles. We did all the big work. When I was little, I was even distraught by it. I felt like it's not fair that my parents' generation, they had
the big fights.
They had the 6-Day War. They had the struggle for Soviet Jewry. They had all these big, heroic battles, and they left us with figuring out how to price cottage cheese. That's how I felt. But I really felt like we're already basking in the light of the future, in a sense. And I don't mean it necessarily in messianic terms.
Yeah.
I mean it more in the sense that, that's it. We have a sovereign Jewish state in the land of Israel. Who could have imagined it? A democratic one at that. That never happened before. Here we are, in a place of Torah, in a place of learning, in a place of a strong civil society. And then realizing that the battle isn't over, and the road is longer than I expected it to, and we weren't on a linear ascent, but rather there's ups and downs. I felt as if I was thrown into the world of Sefer Bamidbar, and I wanted to know how they found strength and what they held on to, with a somewhat naive or childish hope that maybe it'll answer my need for something to hold on to.
I only want to respond to that personally with two thoughts. One is that, and it's almost embarrassing to bring it up because it's of the natural order of the world, but I guess I can think of two examples of where I personally experienced the carpet being pulled beneath my feet, one of which I'll share in this forum, and that was when my father passed away. And it's just my best personal example of the sense of, all of a sudden you realize everything has to be reformed. There's the loss itself of what do you do with that open, gaping hole in your heart. And then there's the identity piece. I remember thinking, oh, now I'm a young mother who doesn't have a father. Now my children don't have a grandparent. And I remember that because I grew up also, I'm named Yosefa, not shockingly, after a grandfather Yosef, who I never met. And it was like, oh, my kids are gonna have that experience also of that grandfather that they never knew. And it was like this moment, most of it wasn't conscious at the beginning. It took a long time for it to become conscious. But that sense of where everything now has to reorient itself.
Yes.
And so in a very natural but sad circumstance of my own life, I get very much what that means. But what I want to say next connects to the second piece is that I just want to say that I find it so interesting that you were experiencing, and you along with many, I think, were experiencing that we were in a pretty good moment where we're on the road to Oz or whatever it is. And I just want to say that I think we're living in pretty related realities, and I really didn't experience the land of Israel and the state of Israel in that way. And so for me, this is simply a response. There's nothing, this is just observatory. It's so interesting that while there were elements of this in the brutality that were shocking to me, it could be that you're a far more positive person, and I have grown up in a family culture only with good confirmation bias by my father passing away from a terrible disease, that I was kind of always preparing for the next disaster. It's unfortunately a Fogel trait. Every single one of my siblings would agree, and I'm trying very hard not to pass it on to my children. But isn't that interesting how many people in this country experience it as an utter earthquake? And I just imagine that I am not unique, and that there are many who said, oh, well, I think that there was a certain shock at the brutality. I think that there was a milestone here of maybe some people in the world. I don't know. I'm not really depending on them, but some people in the world really realizing that there really are people in this world that are operating with a completely different value system. And so I just want to put that there, which is that I'm listening to you, and I know, and I have many, many friends who express that same sentiment. And it may have to do with an inner temperament of mine. And I'm not saying nothing was less horrific, but I didn't have that same sense that I did have when my father left
Yeah.
this world, that like everything now has to be reoriented.
Yeah. I think it's really important that you're bringing it up, because it's important to validate that different people experience it differently, and that our experiences, I think it's not just temperament, it's also expectation. You know, like whatever you expect, if something strays away from your expectation, that's when you're shocked.
Yes.
And I think I wasn't naive in the sense that I thought, you know, doves with olive branches are flying around us.
No.
But I really thought that we're past that stage, the kind of fighting for our foundation.
Bringing us to our knees. That we were past being brought to our knees.
Exactly.
No,
I thought we were
understand
past that. But I think that it just says that I need to adjust my expectation. It doesn't mean that I was right or wrong. It's just a different way outlook. That said, I wonder if you would agree with me when I say that once we recovered or moved past or threw ourselves into doing what we needed to do to move past that original shock and get back on our feet, the book of Bamidbar became relevant in another way, and that was when the war just kept going and going and going. And I wonder if that's something you would relate to, that, you know, there were the first few months of the war when it felt like all of Israel was like a giant fist that just clenched to fight the war. And then it just kept on going. And all the energy reserves that we gathered up to write a sprint turned out not quite to be sufficient for a marathon, and then a double marathon and a triple marathon. And then I kept thinking about that lengthening
I think the
road.
comparison here is unbelievably important. You know, as you said, Bamidbar was supposed to be a very, very short book.
Yes.
It was supposed to be our shortest book.
Yes.
And it ends up being an incredibly long journey. And I think I believe I might have mentioned it in a different episode with Tanya White, but you brought up the word linear. And stereotypically, a linear perspective is a male perspective, meaning energetically it's male. And what we discover in the book of Bamidbar is that we are in a circular motion. We as a people are in a somewhat of a cyclical. You can look at there's some repeated stories or almost repeated type stories in the book of Bamidbar, and we're on this journey to transform ourselves and not necessarily to get somewhere. And we start off thinking we're on our way to go somewhere, and we realize that because of our faults and what we need to obviously improve, meditate on, and transform, we're on a whole different kind of journey. And I think that's just a critical piece of the book of Bamidbar.
In the world of storytelling, one principle or observation that many scholars or expert storytellers make is that in any good story, there's two layers of motivation. The hero sets on his or her way with a motive that's conscious and acknowledged. And almost always in the really good stories, not in the childish, cheap kind of stories, but in the really good stories that you can really sink your teeth into, somewhere around the midpoint of the story, that motivation, the conscious motivation, falls apart. And it becomes clear that whatever it was the hero set out to achieve can't be achieved in its simplest form.
Yeah.
But then it's not the end, because then a deeper layer of motivation becomes visible or becomes accessible to the hero, and they can go on and pursue that. And I feel like, in a sense, Bamidbar does that for us on the national level, that we think our purpose is we're going to make it into Israel and have a good life. And that's still something that's going to happen, and here we are in Israel. And I think with everything, we're still living a good life in Israel.
A great life.
It's Yom Ha'atzmaut this week. There's a lot to celebrate, a lot to be thankful for. But that's not the point. There's a deeper motivation that the people need to discover for themselves of what it is to be in covenant with God, what it is to be a nation, what it is to be self-motivating as a nation. And only when they uncover that, only when they tap into it, and apparently they need that generational shift to take place for that to happen, can they actually reach their destination.
So what are some of the points about the book of Bamidbar that you feel have, I'm going to go back to the word reoriented, but what did you see anew in this new exploration into what is, I assume for all of us, a relatively familiar book?
So before I go into the specific things that stood out to me, and you could be here all day, but I'll choose a few. I want to say that I went into it with a different lens, and that I think that changed what I saw. And the lens wasn't just, oh, we're at war and our road is lengthening, so I am more attuned to what it means to have a longer road, and I can read it differently now. I also had a purpose, and the purpose had to do with this overwhelming sense that the right thing to do when we're facing such a difficult war and such a difficult burden is to adopt a position of radical, in Hebrew you'd say senegoria. How would you say that?
A defense.
A defense, a radical defense of Am Yisrael. That it's not my job to criticize or to argue or to point out all the things we're doing wrong, and there are things that we're doing wrong now and in the book of Bamidbar. But what I really felt, and maybe it's presumptuous to say, but I really felt like what God wants from me, from us, is to stand up for one another, is to be defense attorneys on each other's behalf. You see it in Tanakh all the time, that God wants the prophets to stand up for Am Yisrael. And prophets that go too far into criticizing Am Yisrael, like Eliav, get recalled.
Yeah, they lose their job.
They lose their job, yes. Nicely, and with good retirement plans. Not necessarily, but they lose their jobs. And I felt like this is what we're called upon to do. And I feel that in my life, within current events, that it's not my job to point out all the things everybody's doing wrong, but rather to look for the good. And I felt like it's my job as a Torah teacher. And I wanted to go back to Bamidbar because we're so critical of that generation. They made so many mistakes, and there's so many shortcomings that are revealed. And I said, no, I want to read it as a defense attorney on their behalf. I don't want to look at it from above, from God's perspective, and say, no, you're doing this wrong and you're doing that wrong, and you deserve this and you deserve that. I want to put myself in their shoes and look at it from the bottom up and try and understand them. Because maybe by finding grace for them and myself, I can I can better invite God to find grace for us, in a sense. And from that perspective, once I looked at it from trying to look through their eyes, several things became very clear to me, or that's not really a fair way to put it, became clearer or became present. They came into focus for me. And one of them was that from their perspective, they didn't trust their leadership, nor did they have reason to. And that is, I think, the critical piece. We read the Chumashim from God's perspective, and then once we meet Moshe, very much from Moshe's perspective. And we have immense sympathy for him because we see the enormity of the undertaking he has to take, and how hesitant he is to take it upon himself, and how difficult it is for him to do it, and how many setbacks there are for him, and how stubborn the people are. But look at it from their perspective. In Egypt, they're told what to do by Paro. Their life is difficult and bad, but they know what's going on. Then this guy shows up, who maybe some of them remember as a prince of Egypt growing up in the court. Maybe most of them probably don't even know who he is. And he brings memories of this God that most of them probably don't remember, honestly. And some forefathers they're not really aware of so much in their lives. And he keeps talking about these images of future that they can't comprehend and dragging them along. And there's moments of elation, there's moments of excitement, of the possibility of something else, but there's also a lot of terror. There's the night where they have to put the blood on the doorpost and listen as the Egyptians around them are shrieking because their children are dying. And there's the moment by the sea where they have to just start marching into the ocean. And then there's no water, over and over again, there's no water. And then there's some weird food that no one ever heard about. And there's a God with very harsh demands, who demands that they suddenly go from 0 to 100 in terms of their self-discipline, in terms of what their life goals are, how they orient themselves, how they arrange themselves. And when you think of it like that, when you really understand, when you really give room or make space for their experience, it makes perfect sense that they're not just jumping on the wagon and trusting in Moshe and Aharon and whatever they say is kazera eve kadesh, right? See this and do like that, from their perspective. And once you understand how difficult it is, the tensions between Moshe and the people throughout Bamidbar no longer look, at least to me, as a series of failures. They look as challenges. They look as moments when they have to grapple with placing their trust in someone when they don't know if they can, when they're afraid of being hurt. And even more than that, they are hurt. Putting their trust in God leads sometimes to being hurt. We see that they're hurt when they withdraw that trust, when they give that trust but then withdraw it, and then God punishes them when they start criticizing Moshe or complaining about things, and they're punished harshly with death time and time again. But from the perspective of the survivors, they don't look at it as, oh, we withdrew our trust and that's why we suffered. They say, maybe we shouldn't have trusted in God in the first place.
Yeah.
And we said we're going to talk about the Korach narrative, but I actually want to jump straight to the ending of the Korach narrative first and say that the Korach narrative ends with an open question, and it's a horrifically heartbreaking question. Because after everything, after Korach and the people with him come and make demands, and then some of them die by being swallowed in the ground, and some of them die by fire after they bring Torah, incense that they shouldn't have. And then there's the people still criticize Moshe and Aaron, and there's a plague, and some people die from plague. And then that ends when Aaron runs between them with the incense on I don't know, how do you call it? Machta. I'm not sure.
I don't know, on the plate.
On the plate, sort of, whatever.
Yeah, plate.
And it stops the plague, and then God does the miracle of the almond branch that only Aaron's staff blooms. And you would think that that's the end, right? Okay, they did a vote of no confidence in the leadership. The vote of no confidence was overruled by God 3 times. And then he showed them proof that he really is choosing Aaron to be a Kohen, and that's it. But then they come to Moshe and they say, Ha'im hatamnu ligvoa. Have we finished dying?
Yeah.
And it becomes clear, and the commentators really dig into it there, that they've become convinced that living so close to sanctity, to God, is killing them.
Yeah.
They don't see it as we sinned, so we die.
Yeah.
They see it as we're close to God, so we die. And I'm sorry, I feel like I'm rambling on and on and on, but last night I was sitting in my home reading the stories of the fallen of Tashach, of the War of Independence. And it's just something that I started doing for a project, and I just kept, now I can't stop. I just keep reading their own words. There's this book, Vilei Esh, Scrolls of Fire, that collect the words and creative outpour of the fallen. And I just read letter after letter and essay after essay and diary entry after diary entry. And I hear people describing their response to loss, because the war was long enough that people could talk about people who fell in battle a week before, 2 weeks before, months before. And the whole time I'm reading it and I'm seeing how they find the courage to keep on going and swear that they will live to honor the memory of their friends who fell in battle. And I'm aware of the fact that they fell in battle as well.
Yeah.
And I held this moment when I started crying. I'm sharing something very personal, but I started crying and I said, Ha'im tamnu ligvoa, like, will it ever end? Here are these young men and women who are mourning, and then they're going to fall, and we'll mourn for them. And then, Eliav mourned for friends before he fell.
Yeah.
And it's just, what is it? Why is living in covenant with God so costly? Is it ever going to not be costly? So I think it's an honest question. I think it's a fair question. And we can't just dismiss it as, oh, they didn't trust in Hashem enough.
2 thoughts come to mind in that important reorientation of our perspective with the people, as opposed to looking at it from the perspective of the omniscient narration of Bamidbar. One is that I'm recalling the comment that maybe some of us are familiar with from Rashi, where one of the things that scares the spies when they come into Israel is that they see people constantly burying the dead. And last year, talk about a rereading, that when I was reminded of that commentary, I thought to myself, yeah, if people would look at us in Israel right now, I understand why they wouldn't want to come into this place. We just keep burying our dead. And it was like a wild revival. And again, we've had many periods of life, but this one, as we've said, was just shocking in its volume in terms of how we've experienced life here in the past decades. And I think that there's that similar feeling. I think a lot of us have had it in the past year and a half, of a sense of like, when will it be enough? Meaning, when will this price tag have been enough? Now, we don't live in a mindset where we think that the death of these people is coming to placate God. That's a theology that we don't function with anymore. It does exist in multiple places, and certainly in the book of Bamidbar also, that it's a certain degree of kapara, it's a certain degree of atonement. We don't exist with that theology, and I think that's a great thing. But I think that the sense of the endless loss is something that can be staggering, and it can sweep up a whole generation who then they themselves as a generation won't be able to carry the vision to the next stage. Meaning, there's a very strong statement that basically emerges in the book of Bamidbar that you alluded to earlier, which is that ultimately this generation is not going to be the generation that can come into Israel. I think that there are things that happen to a generation that scar it so deeply that they do, it's not that they're losing eligibility, but that they are no longer appropriate to be those who populate sort of like the next stage of the journey. I think a very similar thing emerges when it comes to Moshe, meaning Moshe himself is not the right leader. He's not the right person.
I want to first address something else you said about generations that become so scarred that they can't carry on into the future. I think it's sometimes true, but sometimes not. And we need to be careful with that kind of diagnosis. Because again, I'm sorry, this is my obsession now. I think about Dor Tashach, the generation that founded the state. So many of them were survivors of the death camps. Yeah. And in my mind, just thinking about it schematically, if someone lived through the dehumanization of the Holocaust, how can they then go on to found a state? And yet they did. Now, it wasn't all of survivors. Some of them were sabras who grew up here with a very different ethos, and there's no question that played an extremely important role. But I guess what I'm saying is that people are capable of a lot of things.
Totally.
That said, I agree that you can only inhabit the stage in history you're in a sense. I think about David HaMelech, who really, really wanted to build the temple, but God says, no. You're a man of war. You spilled a lot of blood. You can't build the temple. And, at first reading, it seems so unfair. He fought those wars because God put him on this path. God told him, you need to become a king, and there are a lot of wars to fight. So how come now, because of something he did in service of God and did well in service to God, he can't build a home for God? He can't show his devotion in this way? But I think that it's actually a deeper statement. It says that David had a historic role to unite the people after the failed kingship of Shaul and defeat our enemies so that we would have some sort of geopolitical stability. And that is a very different role from creating domesticity and intimacy and shalom and all the things we associate with having Beit Mikdash and God dwelling amongst us. You can only inhabit the stage you're in. This is the stage you're in. And with that in mind, I want to say that when I look at this generation of the desert, I see not only their difficulties and the challenge they faced, but I also see that they grew through them. And Moshe grew with them. And I see Moshe as part of the same generation, meaning it's not really Moshe versus the people. All of them have to grow and adjust and learn to trust each other, or at least work together. And they do. And maybe that's the pele, that's the wonder, that's a miracle here, that they do. Over the course of this very violent and harsh episode, slowly you're watching them emerge as a people who can get up in the morning and work together and do great things, even if it's not the things they imagine they're going to do. And I want to focus on one strand of that growth in particular, and that is the evolution of a more dispersed and more varied leadership. You start with Moshe as the leader and doing, kind of representing God to the people, and sometimes, as in the story of the Egel, representing the people to God, arguing on their behalf as well. That's one of the moments when he really steps up to a plate as their leader and not just as God's representative on earth. And you see Aharon, who already in Vaikra obviously is functioning as the ritual leader of the people. But what you watch through Bamidbar is the creation of more and more layers of leadership. Be it from the moment when Moshe says, I can't carry all these people alone, and God adds the 70 elders. You see more and more roles being played by the Nesi'im, the leaders, the princes of each Shevet. And you also see why it's important. Because you see that as long as everything in the relationship between the people and God goes through Moshe as a conduit, they can't develop a sense of security. They can't develop a sense of who they are and their own identity as servants of God. So the fact that God slowly, through these events, and it's interesting that God does it in an ad hoc way, like as response to problems, kind of like we're supposed to do in Pesach, right? We're asked questions and then we give the answers when there's openness to receive them. So God waits for a situation to develop and then says, okay, now have more leaders like that. Now Aharon will be the one responsible for that. Following Korach, by the way, Aharon and the Kohanim get another role that isn't spelled out until then, which is to protect the Mishkan from being approached by people who shouldn't approach it, and protect the people from approaching the Mishkan and dying because they came too close. Mm-hmm. Until then, the responsibility is on anyone who approaches. From that moment on, the punishment is not going to go on, Ploni from Shevet Dan who happened to wander too close. The punishment or the responsibility is in the hands of the Kohen. So again, the Kohanim receive new roles as the book progresses. I think we have a part in creating who we are, and the part is more organic. Here is who we are, and we need this. So God says, okay, so let's do this. And now Moshe says, here is who I am, and I need help with that. Yeah. So God says, okay, it's not just waiting for us to ask for it. Well, God has all the perfect solutions. I think we're partners. This is part of being in a covenant. It's not all spelled out to start with. Part of it is an organic relationship. And this is what we watch emerging. And what's beautiful is that once you pay attention to it, you see that God is totally in for it. God is waiting to give us those opportunities, to help us turn our challenges into opportunities for growth. So instead of just talking about it in the air, I want to see it in the Korach narrative in particular. And I think you see it in 2 points, especially. One point where you see that Moshe grew as a leader and is better adept at dealing with complaints. And one point where you see God being very subtle in offering help to Moshe and Aharon and bolstering their leadership. And the first is the moment when Korach and Adato, who are a group of people who really have a lot not in common, I have to say, common complaint. And why do I say it's not in common? Because Korach himself is a Levi, and he clearly wants to be a Kohen. Mm-hmm. He thinks he should be the more important one. He wants the role, he wants what comes with it, the status, maybe also the pecuniary compensation. He wants that. Then there's the people with him who are not Levi'im and want to be like the Levi'im or maybe like the Kohanim. Mm-hmm. Then you have Datan and Aviram who are just voting no confidence for Moshe throughout. Everywhere they appear.
The classic rabble rousers.
Yeah. Who are just not part of the same narrative and don't want to be part of the same narrative and are just against Moshe from the get-go. And all these people show up, and instead of, listing their complaints, I want to be a Levi, I want to be a Kohen, I don't like you, go away. Mm-hmm. They say, למה תתנסו על קהל השם, כל העדה כולם קדושים? Why are you like treating yourself as if you're so important? Like, why are you raising yourself above the people of God? The whole people are all קדושים. This is a very unfair claim, and it's very disingenuous, because what they want are positions of power. They want to be the ones on top in the imaginary hierarchy. Why imaginary? Because they think that being a priest means you're on top. Like, they just have a very power-oriented vision of what's happening here that's not necessarily true.
And also ironically accusing Moshe, who was the last person to want to have this job, and he seems to be at odds with his job almost until the end of it. So it's also just an inaccurate read of the leader himself.
Yeah, so they're projecting their image of what's happening here, but they're not saying what they really think. What they're saying is everybody should be equal. Mm-hmm. It's like asking someone, when did you stop beating your wife? Like, it's a question that you can't give a good answer to, because any engagement with it acknowledges the premises of the question, and the premises are the problem. Mm-hmm. And Moshe is put in this position, and he has to somehow respond to it. And here we start seeing that Moshe is becoming more and more sophisticated in his handling of the people, because at first, he falls on his face, which is what he and Aaron also did in the story of the Meraglim. Mm-hmm. But there they fell on the face and they didn't speak. And it kind of left a lacuna for the panic of the people to keep swelling into, and for Kalev to jump into and try and silence the people, which didn't actually achieve what Kalev probably hoped it would achieve. Mm-hmm. We can go into that if we'll have time. But here, Moshe falls on his face, but then immediately, vayedaber. He immediately realized he can't just surrender the arena right now. This is not something that can be allowed to stand. But then how do you respond to that? How do you respond to it in a way that is respectful and doesn't escalate the situation, but at the same time somehow doesn't fall into taking what's said at face value? Like, if he goes into a philosophical argument about, yes, kol ha'edah kulam kedoshim, but you need priests, he's totally not addressing the real desires. And if he goes and addresses the real desires, he's leaving this statement standing to galvanize the people who until now weren't part of this argument to say, wait a minute, we are all kedoshim. So he needs to somehow put a stop to it, but at the same time engage with it.
And not immediately be defensive.
Exactly.
Which Moshe knows also how to be, but he's clearly, he's able to hold back here, and he puts them to action. He doesn't try and defend his character, right?
Exactly.
It's a golden rule in life. When you get accused of something that someone knows is not particularly accurate, the worst thing you can do is respond to what's been railed against you.
Exactly. Yeah. And he does in other places, but Correct. Here, instead he says, tomorrow we'll do a test. Mm-hmm. In the morning, we'll do a test. All of you who think you should be the Kohanim, come with machtot, with whatever it is that you put the incense plates. And, whoever God chooses will be chosen. And that's it. So in other words, he is exporting the test. He's saying, let's do, a clean test. But you will have to put yourselves on the line for it, because it's not spelled out. But the understanding is, if you are not worthy, remember Nadav and Avihu? We just read Parshat Shmini now. Remember Nadav and Avihu? Remember what happened when people brought something they shouldn't have brought? Yeah. This is what's going to happen. So you, Mr. Korach, Mr. 250 other men, you have to be very, very certain that this is what you want, and you're willing to take a risk. And he's putting it on them. But he's not just leaving it there. If he just left it there, we could say that's very cruel. He's setting them up to fail, which in fact was criticism that was leveraged against him later. Mm-hmm. Instead, he defers this test. He says that's going to be tomorrow, which is an effective way of saying, now everybody go home and tomorrow come back. Maybe you'll have time to think about it. Maybe you'll have time to sit with it. Maybe your wives will talk you out of it, which maybe is what Aharon hoped for with the story of the Egel, when he sent the people to their wives to collect gold. And then Moshe takes this time, this break that he created between the setting of the terms to the fulfillment of the terms of the test, to talk to them separately. He talks to Bnei Levi and to Korach. And he explains to them, isn't it enough that God gave you such an important job in the Mishkan? You sure you want this additional job. Why are you complaining about Aharon? You know that God is the one who chose him. He's engaging with their real desires. Then he goes to Datan and Aviram and tries to engage with them, which they refuse, but he tries to engage with them. Meaning, he breaks apart this unholy alliance of people who are motivated by different things and tries to engage with each one separately. Mostly it fails. One person, On Ben Pelet, disappears.
Yeah.
There's a beautiful midrash that his wife is the one who really pushed him for that. Yeah. Let's leave it at that. Overall, it didn't work. The people still come and still stand to the test and die for it. But here comes the beautiful moment where God intervenes, I think, to help Moshe and Aaron. Because after the fire kills the people with the incense, and after the earth swallows Korach and his people, the people still complain. Now the people, not just these rabble-rousers or complainers, the whole people, those who watch, instead of being awed by God, they're like, wait a minute, what is this? Why is God killing all these people? What's going on here? And they come to Moshe and Aaron and say, you killed the people of God. You brought about their death. You're the one who set the test, which, by the way, I have to say, is so human. It's so human to, somebody starts a process and then the process bites them back and they're like, oh, somebody did something bad to me.
Yeah.
From their perspective, though, what do they see? They see Moshe says, these people are going to die, and they die. And like, why are you killing the people of God?
Right, ignoring the fact of who began this whole process.
Exactly. Which, again, I think touches to what we talked about before, that we have a lot more information than they did. Yeah. We keep getting God's commentary. We get a very full picture. Mr. Dude, I don't know what, is in his tent, and suddenly there's this thing happening. What does he know about everything that preceded it? He doesn't. Mm-hmm. Long story short, there's a plague as punishment for this. But as the plague is being brought about, God tells to Moshe, Heromu mitoch ha'edah azot ve'akale otam karega. Step out of this edah, and I will destroy them in one moment. And the Parshanim here say that this is a hint that this is preventable, that this plague can be stopped. Because God doesn't actually need Moshe and Aaron to step aside. Mm-hmm. He can just make sure that the right people die and the other people don't. But by telling them step aside, he's telling them your presence amongst them makes a difference. So he's giving them a helpful hint. He's putting himself in the bad cop position right now. And he's hinting to Moshe and Aaron, you have an opportunity to be the good cop. And Moshe picks up on that. And Moshe tells Aharon, Kach et hamachta, take this, the incense dish, and put fire in it, and go walk amongst the people, and it will stop the plague. And Aharon does it. He runs into the people to stop, lechaper, to atone for the people, and he stands between the dead and the living, and the plague stops. So God is giving Moshe and Aharon an opportunity here, and Moshe is giving an Aharon. And at the end of the day, Korach's criticism was leveraged against Aharon's nomination as Kohen. Moshe is giving Aharon an opportunity to model leadership that is not punitive and is not negative, but is rather focused on saving life. And I wonder if part of the idea here is to answer the real distress of the people. Because the real distress of the people is they don't know if their leadership is there to help them or kill them. Mm. And here they're given an opportunity to see with their own eyes how Aharon goes and saves them. I
think what's also significant in this is that when the criticism is first rallied against them, so it just says that Moshe falls to the ground. Vayishma Moshe vayipol al panav. He falls to the ground, but we don't have any description of what happens. But right after that phrase that you read, v'achale otam karega, that God kind of gives them a warning, lets them know what's about to happen. That you have vayiplu al panehem, meaning Moshe and Aaron both fall, and then it says, and then they bring a prayer to God, meaning they immediately. They pray on behalf of the people, right? No, how could it be? One person does something bad and you're going to kill everybody at the same time, meaning they sort of rally against God in this concept of collective punishment. And so you also see that after that first section, that we have them, to go back to your idea of sort of radical defense of the people at this moment, that even after, right, Moshe has had all these conversations and largely all these efforts has failed, he still turns to God in what is, as you said, the quintessential role of the prophet and the leader, in terms of the prophetic leader and prays on their behalf. So that's also a development, because meaning if we were happy in the beginning that Moshe doesn't immediately defend himself, but he doesn't seem to pray on behalf of the people. He just falls to the ground. Perhaps it's in disbelief. Some of the commentaries say he falls on the ground in prayer, but it's not as explicitly stated as it is in this section. I think that there's also significance that they've sort of recalibrated themselves enough that they could see a bit beyond the moment to say, and these people need us to act on their behalf, that they're a little bit beyond the initial shock or defense or disappointment at what's happened, that now they're able to be their emissaries.
Yeah, and I think experience is, the best teacher also. Unfortunately, by this point in the Chumash, there's been quite a few moments of vote of no confidence or distress. I mean, it's after Chatam Erglim, after the road lengthened underneath their feet, which, by the way, for sure feeds Korach's discontent. Yeah. Because it's very different to say, okay, well, whatever, we're just going to survive this little bit and we're going to make it to Israel and everything's going to be different. And being told, no, now you're here for the rest of your natural life, and also you're not going to be the top person, and also this and all. It's just the way you interpret things is different when that's your perspective. But from Moshe and Aaron's perspective, they already went through several moments of what are we supposed to do now as the leaders of the people. And I think that their response time is faster now. And I just want to add one more thing to this thread of watching the people and God and Moshe and Aaron figuring out how to work together and building new layers of who they are and the process and new types of leadership, more leaders, more arrangements. The dividends of it become clearer at the end of Bamidbar, when the new generation rises up. When the new generation rises up, we get a few stories of people stepping up and asking for things that were not offered. I'm thinking of the daughters of Tzlofchad, and I'm thinking of the two tribes, Reuven and Gad, who say, we want to stay in Transjordan. Both of those requests were not in response to something God said, opening the door for it. They just saw an opportunity in the case of the two tribes, or a lacuna or a handicap in the case of the daughter of Tzlofchad, and they stepped up, and they weren't afraid to speak up. And the response to the daughters of Tzlofchad is very positive. To the two tribes is a little more critical, and yet ultimately their request is granted. And I think that there you see that that's what they were growing towards. They were growing towards a place where they feel comfortable enough in their partnership with God, not just to complain when they don't like something, but to ask. Yeah,
to be advocates of themselves.
To be advocates of themselves. Yes. And Aviva Zorenberg, in her reading of Bamidbar, puts a lot of emphasis on that. She says Bamidbar is also Midbar, it's desert, but it's Medaber, it's speech. And it's like they have to go through a growth process that has to do with speech.
I think also part of what is overtly positive in the story of the daughters of Tzlofchad and is more complex, but ultimately, as you said, authorized in the story of the 2.5 tribes, is also this piece about what are they fighting for? Because Korach and his clan, it's a conversation about status and power, and with the other two examples, both of them in their own way are showing a commitment to the land of Israel, meaning they are advocating, the women are advocating to have an allotment. It's like it's the anti-spy story. And in the case of the 2.5 tribes, they're supposed to emphasize, and ultimately it's authorized because they emphasize, we're not going to abandon you, we're going to be part of the process. While we're separating ourselves societally, we will still take part, we will still fight in your wars, almost nauseatingly relevant to our national conversation today, meaning those who understand that they're part of something, yet they also want to be separate, but don't give up on the fact that they're part of. So I think that also, if we, Korach, in my mind, is kind of like I think of the evil son, in air quotes, the evil son on Pesach, right? He takes himself out, and that's what's so bad about what he does. But Benot Tzlofchad and the 2.5 tribes, while they are asking for something for their own, are asking for it while still being definitively inside the group. And I think that that's also a major difference between those stories and, as you're suggesting, part of the development over time, to learn how I can be part of this community, because, part of what they have to do over these 40 years is to create community in a way that they didn't think they were going to have to establish and create boundaries around in the same way. And And we see the success of that in those stories that end the book of Bamidbar.
Yeah, and I do want to say, and maybe that kind of goes counter to my positive reading here, but I do want to say that what they're creating is complexity. At first there's a vision, and the vision is you're going to go out of Egypt, go to Har Sinai, get the Torah, go into Israel. It's a very simple vision. It's not easy, but it's simple. There's not a lot of moving parts. God is the ultimate mover and shaker. We're supposed to just follow and do what he says, and everything will work out. What evolves throughout the reality, kind of the bottom-up, the grassroots reality of Bamidbar and the challenges and fallbacks of it, is complexity. It's a much, much more complicated system with many more people in leadership positions.
So it's more partnership.
It's more partnership, and partnership is always complex. And complexity does come with vulnerability. And I do want to highlight that. The two tribes, it's not actually not the 2.5, it's 2 tribes, and then the half gets tagged to them. But the 2 tribes come and say, we want to stay on this side of the river. And at first, Moshe is very critical. He says, how can it be? Your brothers will go fight and you will sit here. And they say, no, we're going to be the vanguard. We'll fight with them. We'll do it. The truth is, the fact that we have 2.5 tribes in Transjordan did create complicated situations throughout the history of Am Yisrael. And there were more cases of civil war waged between people from mainland Israel and Transjordan than anything else. Yeah. And so it's not that it's all easy peasy, just because God said it's okay. But that's reality. Real life requires complexity, requires different arrangements and different types of relationships and different circles and different communities that overlap and intertwine. That makes a people. The simple vision does not make a people. It makes a dream. Yeah. And this is reality. This is emet me'aretz titzmach. This is the truth that grows from the ground. And the ground is hard.
Rachel, as we wind down this always totally insightful conversation, I guess I want to go back to where we began, which is your desire and need almost to jump back into the book of Bamidbar. Almost, so I imagine you kind of like jumping into the ocean with the people, right? That's kind of the image that you've given us now. So I guess I want to go back to that meeting point between the book of Bamidbar and the moment that we're in right now, the broader moment that we're in Israel as a people, as a nation. Still, even just yesterday, we had 2 lives that were advertised that had been lost to us over the weekend. That were still in this war. So many friends, I'm sure of yours as well as mine, are still in battle. And so I wonder if we could just bring those pieces together as we begin to part from the book of Bamidbar.
So the reason I went into Bamidbar, like I said in the beginning, other than to be an advocate of Mihaif, of my people, the living and the long gone, was to try and learn from that generation how to keep on going when the framework of your expectations, of your dreams, of your understanding of reality crumbles underneath you and the road lengthens and changes. And I think that what I took from it was the realization that they were not in it for themselves. What do I mean? If this generation followed God out of Egypt only for their own personal happy ending, then the second God said this happy ending is no longer available to you, they would have had zero incentive to keep getting up in the morning and walking and following God. I would say more than that, they would have had zero incentive to raise their children to expect to go into the land of Israel and to know the covenant and to follow Moshe and God. But the fact is they did. We don't hear about this decision that each person had to make to keep on doing that. That's not said. In Hebrew say, ikar chaser min hasefer, the main thing is missing from the book. That's just the given. And we discover that it happened in retrospect when we meet the young generation and we see people like the daughters of Tzofchat rising out of it. And we see a generation ready to fight wars and ready to do what's necessary and ready to follow Moshe, and ultimately it's not Moshe, it's Yoshua, into the promised land and fight wars. The readiness of the children is a testament to the education and the upbringing they got at home, which means that even though it's never explicitly stated, every single family of those who survived all these terrible, terrible altercations and difficulties raised their children with a sense of their historic mission. They had to know that they're not going to see the promised land, but they're going to do everything they can to make sure that their kids are prepared for when they do. And in that regard, this generation, the generation of Yotzei Mitzrayim and Moshe, who had so much conflict between them and so much distress between them, are actually the same. They're all pursuing the same goal, because also Moshe, at the end, does not go into Israel, but he does everything he can to prepare the people for this move. And so do the people themselves in a less stated, less glamorous, and yet perhaps even more important way. And I guess for me, what I took from that, from this realization that you can only really see when you read through and then you look back, is a reminder to myself that we're not here just for ourselves and for our span on this earth, however short or, God willing, long it is. We're here because we're part of a relay race. We're here because we're part of a multi-generation journey of a nation living in covenant with God, trying to build Mamlechet Kohanim, the Goy Kadosh, here in the Holy Land. That is a huge task. How ridiculous to think that we can finish it within one lifetime. We can't, and that's okay. And the second I reframed it to myself like that, and I said, it's not about us. It's not about our story and our expectation for our own lifetime. It's about what is the end goal? What is that simple story? And how do we best turn that simple story into an organic part of our lives and our children's life and our grandchildren's life? Once I reframed it for myself like that, I found that I can accept the changes much more fully, because the road may meander and we may be on a downturn or an upturn or both in different ways, but it's ongoing. And that is what matters. What matters is that the road is ongoing, and that we have a mission wherever we are, not to finish it, lo alecha melacha ligmor, or the job is not ours to finish, but to take it one step forward. That's all. And once that became clear to me, I felt like I could make peace with where I am in history right now.
What your concluding remark really brings up for me, and I don't often think about it because I sometimes actually delete from my mind the fact that I am an immigrant to this country. In a weird way, I almost feel like I was born here, but I wasn't. I made a choice to move here on my own, and I was on my 22nd birthday. But you're bringing up for me the fact that I didn't even realize, just like maybe this generation in the desert, how much that peace lives deep inside of me. Meaning when one doesn't originate in this place and then they choose to come here, you kind of are acutely aware of the fact that you're a small piece in something bigger. Meaning, at least for me, in like the purely Zionist way, that's sort of the main reason why I came here. And so there's something about sort of originating from somewhere else, which may be originating from the desert or originating from some other space, and then at least in our case, having the merit to actually live in Israel and raise a family is there's something inherent in there. There's sort of like an inherent understanding that, now I'll say something different. I sort of exist with this deep desire to just be a part of a broader chain, because I'm aware of the fact that my natural story, actually, I was part of a different space, but that I joined a different chain. And so I think that this, no, I want to delete all this, delete all of it. I don't want to delete all of it because I don't like the way it's coming out. I don't want to say it. It's true what I'm saying, but I don't want to say it. Yeah? Okay, so I'm just going to say it smoother. What your incredibly moving description or idea, I'm gonna say it again, your incredibly moving idea about the way we can look at the generation in the desert and what it really reflects about the moment that we're in right now in history. You're making me realize how deep that really does exist in all of us, because as you speak, reflecting on the fact that I immigrated to this country, even though many days I kind of forget that. I kind of feel like I've just been here forever. And one of the reasons why I came here was because I wanted to be a link in a broader chain. And, I was destined, in terms of where I was born, to be part of a slightly different chapter of the Jewish story. And I wanted to be part of this chapter. And I don't think I came here thinking that I was going to sort of end this story or bring it to its culmination. Because when you come sort of from the disadvantage of coming from the outside and then creating your life here, you come in with, a different set of ideas. I want to have Israeli children. I want to be part of what's going on. And there's something about both the presumption that we could complete this story and the humility that comes with realizing that we're part of this broader story that I think is part of everybody's life now in this country. It's not something that you had to have come from the outside to enter into the space, or to grow up here or not to grow up here, but that there's a certain degree, I think, of humility. For some, it's still a brokenness, but meaning there's a certain degree of humility that I think everybody has kind of been imbued with, to see this moment for what it is, and that it's so easy to live in a moment and see it as the everything, but what's happened to us here has sort of made us have to zoom out in our moment in time and to place ourselves on this continuum, because that itself both creates humility, and it also is an important survival technique. Because if we can place ourselves in a continuum, we can also envision for ourselves a moment when this won't be our reality. Meaning, we can also envision when we'll be part of another chapter, when we'll be emerged from this, when we'll recalibrate our footing and be able to feel like we could breathe a little better, we could sleep a little bit better, and that we're part of this bigger process, but that we've emerged already into the next piece of it.
But I just want to, I agree, and I just want to highlight or kind of put the spotlight on one thing, which is sometimes thinking of yourself as a small part of a big picture can be very disempowering.
Yes.
Or liberating in the sense that, so I don't need to do anything. And I think of it the opposite way. I think that when you realize you're one chapter out of a very, very long book, I think Rabbi Sachs talks about it a lot in his books, you realize that, yes, you're one chapter out of a long, long book, but this chapter is yours to write. No one else is going to write this chapter. No one else is going to make the decisions, make the sacrifices, do what's needed in this moment. So in this moment, we are in Eden, and God is walking in the trees, and he asks us, Ayeka, and it's on us to say, Hineni. But it's now. It's not in some other moment. It's now. It's here and now.
Rachel Sharansky Danziger, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Sefa.
And sharing your ideas, your insights, and I think moving and comforting ideas that we're going to take with us now, and I'm sure for a very long time. Thank you.
Thank you, Sefa. May we see softer days.
Amen.